emergency for the first time in about...
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 320.GN4519, certificate number 14871. The Death of Trolleys.
The death of trolleys.
All things must pass, John.
True.
Even trolleys.
Are you, have you ever gone through a phase where you regularly used mass transit?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, anytime I visit overseas, it's such a delight to have functional mass transit. And my kids love it because kids all grow up as transit fans.
Right.
Like America has to turn them into little car kids.
Yeah, you're right. But it's true. It's
Kids are
instinctive.
born liking buses and trains way more.
We're all train spotters.
Exactly. You have to drum it out of you if you want a little patriotic American kid who insists on driving everywhere.
And it's true, really, any major city anywhere outside of America and Canada has a completely functional and bustling little mass transit system.
Mind-bogglingly effective. I love the bustle of the Tokyo trains. Mm-hmm. I love the efficient mapping and signage of the London Underground. I like the beautiful old Art Deco entrances to the Paris Metro.
Every German town has a very efficient and clean trolley. You've got the
streetcar ring that takes you everywhere.
Wonderful sort of vintage cars in Amsterdam and Vienna that share track with new hyper modern cars.
And you feel like you're doing your part because you look around and see a city that is not car choked and car dependent, and you think, well, I want to do my bit for that. I'll take this charming little train instead.
That goes ding ding and then takes you right where you're going.
It goes clang clang when the trolley.
And even cities built on hills, like in Switzerland, I mean, there are mass transit systems that involve funiculars and cable cars.
I love a good funicular.
I know you do. Me too.
That's it literally starts with fun, and they're not wrong.
Interesting.
That's what
ends with icular, which is they're also not wrong.
I mean, testicular starts with something everybody hates, a test.
Right. True.
But funicular starts with something a little better.
It's like
fun.
It's like testicular except fun.
That's what they should say.
And have you, in your experience overseas in all these wonderful little train sets, surely you have reflected on the fact that in the United States we don't seem to be able to make a go of those systems. And have you sat consternated trying to figure out why?
I have, as the quaint European shops drift by the window. My thoughts too drift
ding, ding.
to a different America, where. Because, it's very much a live question here in Seattle where we are finally building light rail decades after we could have.
Right.
Decades after we were offered federal money that instead went to build a non-functioning transit system in Atlanta.
Right. Although I took it not very long ago and it runs.
Didn't you and I take it together?
Oh, we did.
We enjoyed it very much. We went out of our way to take the train back.
We did. In fact, we and remember we sat. Oh no! At one point, we had lunch in a restaurant where they had taken the tracks up and turned it into a into a bike path.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
But we did take the...
That was where Omnibus was born, in fact,
right.
at that steakhouse.
But we took the train and had a lovely old time. We made a transfer even.
We did, and that's part of the fun of it.
Yeah.
You know, if you're a commuter, maybe you complain about having a transfer, but for a tourist, what a treat to transfer from one train to a different train.
We got off and stood there with our map unfurled, and a local person came by and said, "Can I help you? Can I help you, boys?"
I think the problem with the Atlanta system is because it was built in the 70s, the main goal of the planners was to make sure black people never got to go anywhere good.
It's a super brutalist environment, too.
Yeah.
It has... well, and the joke's on them because Atlanta, because the black people ended up getting to go places good in Atlanta.
They did. And it's just now the train doesn't go anywhere useful because people were so worried about it not serving the wrong kind of neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's right. And we risk that even now in building our transit system here in Seattle. Part of the most recent controversy is that the people over in the lily white suburb of Bellevue, or what used to be lily white, now it has
currently the overwhelmingly Chinese suburb of Bellevue.
It has a lot of immigrant population coming to work at Microsoft, but they tried to put the kibosh on building mass transit to Bellevue because they were afraid that it would bring the unsavories.
The evil man who runs the mall was successful in making sure that the train came nowhere near the actual retail core of the city. Because then suddenly you'd see teens from the not-so-good schools scaring everybody away from Swarovski.
Right, coming over to Bellevue Square, which is still the mall that has inexplicably expensive stores in it.
And it's not we don't want it to be a teen hangout.
No.
It's for moms to go to Panera or places maybe even nicer than Panera.
Right. Well, no, we do want it to be a teen hangout, but they have to drive their BMW cabriolets and park in the parking garage.
It's a certain kind of teen who's there to buy something at the Apple store and maybe a $500 Lego set.
Right. But so it surely occurred to you that America could have a functioning, trolley and light rail transit system in our major cities. And it
seems conspicuous by its absence.
It does, doesn't it?
Our cities aren't that much different. I mean, we now have suburban sprawl because of the century of the automobile.
Right.
But there's nothing inherent about San Francisco that explains why Muni and BART are so much lousier than their equivalent in any small German city.
And it's in contrast to the intercontinental rail system, where the size and scope of America and the great distance between our large cities and Canada also, it is more difficult to build a network of rail than it would be in Germany or Holland or Belgium or France, or in fact all of Europe, an interconnected system that all works together. Although there were some gauge problems for a long time in Europe where trains had to stop and change undercarriage.
I think I once accidentally only booked myself halfway between Paris and Barcelona because I didn't realize you have to get out at whatever the last French city on the line is and get onto a different kind of train to go through the Pyrenees.
Right, because the rail gauge is different.
Because Franco didn't want his trains to be the right width or whatever.
And
who would?
Rightfully so.
It's the only thing that appeals to me about fascism. The trains might not run on time, but they run on very odd scaled tracks.
And so when you're in Europe and you're traveling by rail from country to country or city to city, and reflect on the fact that, or in Japan, and reflect on how efficient it is and how well designed and built those systems are, that doesn't instantly translate to the United States. And we're seeing right now Elon Musk's attempt to build a high-speed rail from San Francisco to Los Angeles becoming just this bugbear of cost overruns and it increasingly looks like it's not going to be anything close to what was promised, which was a maglev train inside of a vacuum tube or something like that. And now it just looks like it's going to be a train.
It's you don't expect something the size of the United States to be like Wales, where you can just get up and take the train to the other side of the country, because the United States is not the size of Wales. It's one of the It's one of the things we boast about.
Right.
Bigger than whales,
Bigger than whales.
we say on our Great Seal, on
Also,
the $1 bill.
I would say Wales is a bad example of a country that you can navigate all four corners by rail.
That's true. But, but the South of England, though.
Yeah, sure.
For example.
Sure, you're all over there on a train.
Every hour there's a train to the place you want to go.
But the frustrating thing about our cities is that although many of them, particularly in the West, are built on larger, wider street plans than, say, for instance, a medieval German city, there isn't any reason why light rail wouldn't work just as well here as there. Made even more frustrating by the fact that many of these American cities were actually designed around public transit, tracked transit, electric trolleys.
I didn't realize that until moving to Seattle, I think, because then you can see all the weirdly wide streets that used to be streetcar lines, all the current cool biking and hiking trails that were once interurban rail, and you realize, before everybody could afford a car, we had very functional transit in this remote corner of the country, which means I assume pretty much every U.S. city had really good streetcar lines.
Functional transit and transit that the construction of the transit actually focused and affected the way the city grew and the way the city built. And in a lot of cases, transit investors and transit companies were also connected to property development, so that it
wasn't just,
it was a mutual interest or even
or corruption, one would say,
or corruption. And there's a ton of corruption in this story for sure. But tracked transit started even before electricity. It was trolleys were put into American cities and European cities in the mid 19th century, and they were drawn by horses or by mules.
Yeah, I've seen that. But why do you need the rails?
Well, because in those cities at that time,
the horses were dumb and would take the wrong turn.
Horses have always been incredibly smart. They're just as smart in 1850 as they are now, which is to say extremely smart. And
you seem to be worried that I'm going to get canceled.
To our future equine listeners.
Hello, centaurs of the future.
Let me just say, Ken misspoke. The quality of the roads in those cities were cobblestone and broken macadam and pebbles and skulls of our enemies and logs.
Which cities in particular were paved with the skulls of our enemies? Indianapolis?
Gomorrah, and that's right, and Tampa. But also mud and, city streets were not smooth, and rail was.
A bus-like thing would have just been rattling all over.
Rattling constantly. And if you put a trolley on tracks and pulled it with a horse, it was the smoothest and most efficient way to move people through a city, and it was kind of a revelation. And
it goes clang, clang, clang.
It did.
The previous song would have been blah, 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 went the trolley.
And so that method of public transit kind of exploded and became very popular, and it was during a time of horse-drawn carriages were the primary means of conveyance outside of walking or I guess riding on a horse. It was pretty easy to dedicate a certain section of the street to this gleaming new rail, influenced by the spread of steam locomotives around the world. And rail was kind of the new fashionable style.
I wonder why no steam solutions. I guess it's not efficient on a small scale.
Not efficient on a small scale would have been, just another element of total pollution, and just much cheaper to have a horse pull, because you're going to be doing lots of stops and starts, right? It's a little trolley. You're going to go up 3 blocks and stop.
You don't want somebody shoveling in coal. Right. You can just shovel oats into your horse instead.
So this infrastructure was built, and then when electricity became a new utility, these lines were all electrified, and trolley lines and electric companies were also often in partnership or cahoots.
Depends on who you ask. The press release said partnership. Somebody else might
the
have
other
said
contract
cahoots.
said cahoots.
Nobody's ever in good kind of cahoots.
Yeah, there were. This was the era, of course, of antitrust or of the big trusts, and American business then as now is always seeking to find opportunities to exploit new efficiencies and also to develop a kind of top-down or symmetrical. How do you describe it?
Vertical integration.
Vertical integration is
Where
right.
you control every aspect.
Every aspect. So if you could control the delivery of electricity, the supply of parts, the rails and cars themselves, and the property out in the suburbs where the new houses were being built, that the tracks went out to, you had a perfect vertical integration of a whole system.
It's not just livery stables that are out of business. You can put people out of business at every level of the economy.
That's right. And that was part of the early development of the trolley systems in the country. So much so that those early public transit magnates who sought to find opportunities to have monopoly control over public transit were regarded, and this is crazy to us now because we think of public transit exclusively in terms of the public good.
Those are the good guys,
and
pushing back against big business.
That's right, and they're a liberal cause celeb, right? But at the time, the what were called the traction interests.
Traction.
Because traction was
it's the noun form of laying track. I
that's
guess.
right. Well, and also like the electricity provided the traction for the trolley. The traction interests were seen as monopolists and kind of a rapacious capitalist that was coming in and not just monopolizing this business, but also our city streets.
I want to go back to a world that's so innocent that your Lex Luthor is the guy who runs the streetcar line.
Runs the streetcars, right?
I feel like I could do okay.
By the turn of the century, of course, I mean, most American cities, not just the big ones, had, just like we were talking about in Europe and Asia, there were trolley lines, extensive trolley lines.
It probably led to some sprawl, right? Like we think of that as an automotive problem.
It led to sprawl in a sense that we now think of even the furthest extent of the trolley lines as being kind of within the city, right? I mean, if we think here, West Seattle, we still talk about the junction up at the top of West Seattle. Well, that was a streetcar junction. There hasn't been a streetcar there in 70 years.
Nothing gets joined at the junction.
But we still call it the junction. And that would have felt then like a long way out of town.
Yeah.
But now, if you can afford to live at the junction, it's thought of as like, well, I mean, you're still in West Seattle, let's be honest. But it feels like town.
So it created sprawl at a scale that we would think of today as kind of still responsible and manageable.
There was, you could always walk. If you were able-bodied, you could walk the distance that the streetcar could take you. But of course, that's a false standard.
But you couldn't hang off the back if you're Buster Keaton or Harold Lloyd. That's what streetcars are for.
My dad grew up in Seattle in the 1920s and 30s, and he couldn't afford the nickel to ride the streetcar. But he, in his knickers and leather shoes that required some strange wood-handled hook to tie, he would run after, grab a hold of the cow catcher on the back, and crouch down and ride.
So he would do the free kid riding thing, just like in an old-timey movie. Is a nickel about right? Is that just your hypothetical?
I think. Well, it was probably a penny, and then so a nickel fare became the standard cost nationally of a streetcar ride. And in many, many cases, that was mandated.
Streetcar circles, that's what nickels were called.
Streetcar circles. And tokens were often used, but those tokens cost a nickel. And in many cases, what happened...
That's a big token for you, trying to
that's right.
introduce a middleman.
Well, that's just a token comment.
Tokenism?
In their haste and desire to establish kind of monopoly control over transit systems within cities, a lot of the transit purveyors, a lot of the traction interests, were quick to agree to business arrangements with city governments where they said, in exchange for a monopoly interest here, we will maintain the right-of-way, we'll be responsible for snow plowing and for keeping the roads in good order, and we will stick to a 5 cent cost for a streetcar ride with no provision for inflation. No, it was part of this the way that the cities negotiated these contracts. They said, you have to keep the cost at 5%.
That's a good
5
deal.
cents.
Now, by the way, that would be less. That would be around 75 cents today,
Yeah.
depending on whether this was 1920 or 30 or 40. But that's a cheap ride.
It was a cheap ride, but a profitable one, because at the time, the way there wasn't a ton of competition, and
And not a lot of complexity to building these things.
that's right. Once they were built, operating them was fairly cost effective. Although there was a kind of legacy, a legacy culture of having 2 operators per train that was kind of a holdover from
like a driver and a conductor.
or a holdover from even like the crew that would run a horse team. You had 2 people sitting there, and they were superfluous. The second one was superfluous in an electric trolley, but it was kind of an institution by that point. But even so, the employees at the turn of the century were the cost of having 2 trolleymen wasn't an onerous cost.
The first time I ever rode city buses much, because I never my dad took the bus in Seattle to work, but I walked to school. And so the first time I ever rode a city bus much was in South Korea. And in the early 80s, all buses had a driver and a second person, usually a young gloved woman.
Halfway up the bus?
Halfway up the bus, who appeared to have no job, really. It was definitely a relic of a different time.
Yeah,
because
make work.
Maybe at some point, she took fares or something, but that had kind of all gone away with better mechanized buses. And I don't know how long that lasted.
Did she have a seat, or did she stand through her whole work day?
I think she had a little seat by the door. And that went away sometime in the late 80s. But you could definitely see just whatever the technological legacy was, it had left an extra person with a job, and it's hard to legislate that away.
You remember riding the monorail in the 70s and 80s, where the pilot would pull into the station and dock, and then pull their little handle out that allowed them to control the motor. It was a kind of a little it looked like the handle of a large coffee grinder. And then they would carry the handle all the way through the train to the other end and insert it into the control panel at the other end.
Why didn't the monorail just have a handle on each end?
Well, because the handle was the key. That was the
It's like without this handle, it's almost a ceremonial thing. It's like delivering the crown jewels.
It
or
really
something.
was. You got I guess probably when you got your certification to drive it, they probably called it getting your handle.
Hear ye, let it now be known, the monorail is going the other way.
But I remember watching that pilot and just thinking that was the greatest job in the world, and they didn't have an assistant.
It should be on a little pillow. Carries it all the way to the back of the train.
But it really was the success of the trolleys that began the process of their own demise. The trolleys took people out to, the extent of the line. And here in Seattle, as you said, you can see all the streets that used to have trolley lines, Yesler and Union and so forth. You can go sort of down the street and see which neighborhoods and which little stores, little clusters of stores were located at former trolley stops.
Yeah.
But this started to create a kind of envy on the part of people that lived just a little bit further out of town. The people that were kind of living in a rural, slightly exurban areas, who felt like the trolley line went out to some neighborhood, Ravenna or someplace, and stopped. And at that point, also, the streets stopped being maintained and the snow stopped being plowed. There was a movement in the 19th century, the late 19th century, called the Good Roads Movement, which was a kind of national movement to improve the quality of roads in the country. people that, it was kind of the era of the rise of the bicycle and the notion that time in the country was good for you.
Well, was this kind of for city people as much as it was for people who lived out there?
It was a sort of, the type of thing that if there were an NPR at the time, they would have supported the good roads movement. But it was an idea that now that we had these roads, now that you could conceivably get from city to city on this network, that now our next step was to improve them and make them not just transit corridors, but to elevate the entire network, to make it homesteady and pleasing. Because that's what was happening in the cities, right? Parks were being built, boulevards, and people in the country recognized that, or people in the surrounding areas also wanted some of those amenities. And as part of that, the idea of bus service started to enter into the equation.
What would an omnibus have been back then?
It would have been
horse-drawn, or
initially horse-drawn, and then gradually just wheeled trolleys, but that could then travel further out from the last rail stop, from the last trolley stop.
Were they the same vehicles? They could just literally go off the rails?
No, there was a separate network of buses that would then take you from the last trolley stop and take you out to your house further afield. And the buses were more flexible because you could turn. You didn't have to follow the track. They were more expensive at the time, but only slightly, because there was, because although operating costs were higher, gradually over time, infrastructure costs were a lot lower, right? You didn't have to maintain a track network.
Yeah.
And so right about World War I era, the rail networks kind of reached their apogee, and we're now connecting to these bus networks. A man by the name of John D. Hertz, and he wasn't actually born John D. Hertz. He was born Sándor Hertz.
Sándor?
Yeah, and he's from Slovakia.
Isn't Sándor a much cooler name than John?
Sándor is great, as a great name. John D. seems to echo John D. Rockefeller, and maybe a thing that he took on after he emigrated to the United States.
Was the D for Dick? Like, is Dick Hertz?
Oh.
No.
God, this is a family show.
Were you never in the fourth grade? You don't remember Dick Hertz?
I was in the fourth grade before that kind of humor was popular, my friend.
Dick Hertz having not yet been invented yet. Yeah, so he's the rental car namesake, right?
Yeah, but in fact, J.D. Hertz probably deserves his own entry in the omnibus, because before he founded Hertz Rental Cars, he actually founded the Yellow Cab Company.
Huh.
Hertz was one of these plucky sort of immigrant characters who came to the U.S. and was a teenage boxer, and then became a newspaper delivery boy, which he turned into a job as a newspaper reporter, and then he somebody suggested that he become a used car salesman in the very early days of cars.
The beginning of used cars.
And after he owned a couple of cars, he started to lease them out. And then he kind of started a cab company. And after running a cab company for a while, he started to build buses. Oh, he started a company building cabs, yellow cabs. And then he extended that to building coaches, which he called the Yellow Coach Company.
This guy's doing vertical integration, but he's just trying everything. He's trying every step of the ladder.
And at a certain point, he combined all of his coach building operations into a company called the Omnibus Corporation.
Hey.
Where he was supplying coaches to all these different transit companies.
I want to hear about when he took out John D. Avis. Just destroyed him.
He started Hertz, his rental car company, which was called Hertz Drive Yourself, and
which is
and in the popular style, it was Drive-UR-Self. So he was very much pre-internet there.
He invented text speak.
Yeah, Drive Yourself. But he and during this era, like cab companies and transit companies, this was all, these were highly competitive businesses. There was a lot of kind of gangsterism.
You got to pay off the right people to get the right contracts.
Companies were blowing up one another's stables and one another's bus depots. But Hertz ended up selling. He sold interest in his company to General Motors, and ended up being on General Motors' board of directors. And at the point at which General Motors enters into the story, we're arriving at a moment in streetcar history that became very that became a point of great controversy later in looking back, because there was this sort of pivotal moment right after World War I where streetcars went into decline. And in later years, there was a lot of contention about what it was that caused this decline. But it's
because everybody saw Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
That's right.
And realized it was a conspiracy by the freeways, by Christopher Lloyd, by someone to shut down all the trolleys.
Well,
now today, trolleys only go to the neighborhood of Make-Believe. They don't even go to Toontown anymore.
Roger Rabbit came out in 1988, but this conspiracy theory had its origins a lot earlier than that.
So it's reflecting something people already believed about how the trolleys died.
That's right. And the conspiracy story started in the 1940s. And in fact, the companies that comprised the conspirators were General Motors and Firestone Tires, Standard Oil of California, all the great, like small businesses.
All the great villains from American corporate history, and all people who would benefit from the institution of car culture.
Phillips Petroleum and Mack Trucks, all together as a consortium, started some transit companies, or rather bought pre-existing transit companies under the aegis of National City Lines, and through that company started buying up defaulting transit companies across the United States.
Just bus and streetcar lines?
Streetcar lines in particular.
And what did they do with them, with their new... It's just like the hedge fund people that like buy Toys R Us and then fire 50,000 people.
Yeah, they bought up the transit companies, tore up the rails, and replaced them with buses.
Oh, okay. Because...
Well, so the conspiracists would have you believe, and have us all believe, that this was their naked self-interest.
Sell more cars and oil.
And
tires.
And deprive us of the choice of public transit.
Of not driving cars and filling our cars with gas.
That's right. And to take away these public works, right? Transit systems that belonged to cities that served the people, and replace them with the what seemed to be an option, but what in fact became a necessity.
Privately owned
cars. And this conspiracy was this National City Lines process started in the late 30s. All these transit companies were in receivership, a lot of them bankrupt already, and being purchased and dismantled by this National City Lines and its subsidiaries, the American City Lines and the Pacific City Lines.
In general, were they in trouble because of the creeping influence of cars? Like, is it a cause and effect thing?
Well, so now this is the place where this conspiracy is kind of debunked by history or debunked in retrospect. And the desire for it to be a conspiracy has always been political, even from the late 1940s when it was sort of first floated. These companies were actually prosecuted and prosecuted in what looked like an antitrust prosecution, but really, I mean, they were prosecuted for the antitrust crime of controlling a monopoly in the manufacture of parts and services for buses. Like it was not
a widespread,
not a sweeping prosecution. And even that prosecution, the judge that oversaw the trial said that it was he felt that the jury was influenced by an emotional appeal. But the death of the trolley had started a long time before, and it was a product of this confluence of factors that we've kind of already discussed. One of them being that the trolley interests, the traction interests rather, had agreed to contracts with cities that did not have a lot of leeway to account for inflation or changes in ridership. So the companies were on the hook for maintaining the roads and were only able to charge a nickel for fares.
They're locked into a nickel.
And as more and more people started using the roads, as the rise of the automobile meant that these roads were now in widespread use by a variety of motor vehicles, the transit companies, for-profit companies, were maintaining the roads on behalf of the city for the good of all, with no return.
Free rider problem.
And the cars that were now choking the streets drastically reduced the efficiency of the electrified rail, because all of a sudden these trolleys were stuck in traffic. Mm-hmm. And the cities where trolleys remained viable, and it's really only a handful that survived through this whole period, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco.
Did they have dedicated lanes?
Or were elevated roads? Yeah. And so any town like Seattle or Atlanta or St. Louis, where the trolleys had to share the roads, all of a sudden they're stuck in traffic. And although they were still only a nickel, they were now in competition with the buses that had originally just been part of the system to continue the travel at the end of the trolley line. The bus owners and bus interests,
of course, they're going to want to move into areas of greater density. That's where the greater profit center is. So a fuller bus if you go all the way to the city center.
Instead of dropping you off at the railhead, they just kept on.
Big omnibus.
That's right.
How I hate it.
And so, yes, these General Motors and Firestone saw that their interests coincided with those of buses rather than rail, but rail ridership was plummeting.
They were not shutting down a thriving enterprise because it was doing so well.
Right.
But they would have, if it was doing so well, they would have held on to it.
And people were naturally gravitating to cars and buses because of the appeal of the new form, right?
It's the novelty of it.
And
the independence, you can go straight to your driveway instead of just to 3 blocks from your apartment or whatever.
That's right. But this became, in the second half of the 20th century, as urbanism started as the philosophy of urbanism started to become kind of an academic discipline, and the memory of these lost trolleys still lived in recent memory. I mean, I don't know. You couldn't possibly remember this, and most listeners won't, but in the early 70s, when I was a kid, there was in Portland, Oregon, still a trolley barn where all the old wooden trolleys that had been retired from the Portland streetcar system were stacked one on top of another, piled up.
What were they being kept for?
They just they'd never set them on fire. They hadn't gotten around to, and throughout the 60s and 70s, you would see these in the outskirts of American towns, these big, just dumping grounds of old trolley cars.
Were they occasionally repurposed like photo mats? Weren't there sometimes little, fish and chip stands or whatever that were
little diners
that were trolleys?
There was some of that. There were some old trolleys that were converted to buses, and they're beautiful to see when you see a little thing that clearly used to be a train that now is a bus. But a lot of them were, even by the time they were retired, they were pretty decrepit. And they just sat stacked one atop the other. And I have a picture of me and my sister. I was probably 5 and she was 3. And for whatever reason, we were in our Sunday best. She's in this, white dress, ankle-length dress, and I'm in some kind of little white suit with a blue bow tie. And we're standing inside of a very old trolley car with the windows all busted out and the floors and ceilings, everything's made of wood, like very weathered wood at the time. And I think that car was sitting on top of another car, and there was a car on top of it. And my dad had hoisted us up there somehow for this photograph.
Child safety having not yet been invented.
That was not yet invented. And I'm sure that those trolleys didn't survive past 1976. It would have, all would have finally been crushed up.
Yeah, they weren't yet old enough to seem cool.
No, hardly at all.
They just seemed like the previous technology. It seemed like, your grandma's old vacuum or something. No, there's no nostalgia for them yet.
But by the mid 70s, and this was during a time when the Atlanta mass transit system was built, and the Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, when suddenly there was a resurgence in rail.
Probably oil crisis leading to federal investment. Is that right?
Oil crisis and a desire also to make cities accessible, to build these utopias, these urban utopias. There was
You're starting to see the first ill effects of white flight, right?
And there was a lot of awareness, I think, that awareness of the tendency to try to not build transit to serve poorer communities, and there was a lot of pushback from progressive interests that wanted to make sure that transit did serve those populations, and of course it was politics, right? So it wasn't. A lot of it was for show, and a lot of it got blocked.
A lot of it was to have your local guy look like a good guy because he's fighting to bring the trains to the neighborhood.
Even though he knew that there was no chance.
He probably takes a payoff to quiet down at some point. That's what usually happens.
During the Johnson administrations or the Johnson administration and the subsequent sort of Nixon era, there was from Congress a lot of energy directed toward urban renewal, and we've seen it in a lot of different aspects of what urban renewal was, what they thought it was going to do, how they were going to roll it out. But in 1964, there was an act called the Urban Mass Transportation Act, which was an attempt to have a coordinated, not coordinated system, but a coordinated mentality about urban mass transit. And that was extended. There was then a subsequent Mass Transportation Act in 1970 that was part of this system of grants that resulted in the construction of MARTA in Atlanta and BART in San Francisco, and would have produced a Seattle mass transit system if we had only voted to accept the money.
1% more vote or something.
And because that was part of the National Mass Transportation Assistance Act. And all of this was, a congressional recognition that oil crisis, gridlock, but also urban renewal efforts, attempts to combat the death of the inner city and offset some of the effects of white flight from urban cores, all sort of part of this great society attempt by mid-century intellectuals to
cities are getting worse, but we're still the greatest country in the world. We can do better.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, enter into this Ralph Nader, a frequent guest on our program.
Your former boss.
That's right. Who kind of looking back at the way that streetcars disappeared from the American scene, and the role that the National City Lines and General Motors played in the aftermath. And as you know, Ralph Nader and General Motors already had
history.
They had a nice relationship with one another. He kind of made this assertion that that the death of the streetcar was part of a larger conspiracy on the part of these oil and gas and car industries.
So he popularized this historical misconception.
He popularized it, and then in 1973, a man by the name of Bradford Snell wrote what became a very controversial paper, asserting the whole broad conspiracy that we came to understand as the facts on the ground during the Roger Rabbit era. I mean, everything subsequent.
I always think of that as the Roger Rabbit era of American history.
They were all sort of based on this testimony that Snell gave to the Senate, and that became then a received understanding that a lot of politicians, the mayor of San Francisco, a lot of people that wanted to politically present themselves as pro-city, pro-transit, anti-corporation, and anti, even in the mid-'70s, these companies were also recognized as polluters, as counter-revolutionary. I think General Motors and Phillips Petroleum probably are among the most counter-revolutionary companies. So they became kind of punching bags or straw men to attribute all of the problems of pollution, oil dependence, reliance on the car, which are all real problems and all problems promulgated by General Motors and Phillips Petroleum, but they were then set up against this idealized version of what America could have been, one where it wasn't just that the trolleys went away because of a multitude of forces, it was that they had been destroyed.
The thing about conspiracy theories is they often simplify a problem, and that's very tempting. Instead of saying, well, it was a whole confluence of things, nobody likes to hear that. What you want to hear is, here's the deal. It's from a policy point of view, it's pleasing because it makes it seem more solvable. But also we crave narrative. Like from a narrative point of view, it's like, here's a story I can tell and you can understand. The evil car and tire and oil interests killed the trolley.
Right. And it's 100% true that General Motors did not have any interest in electric trolleys. They wanted them gone because they were in competition with their desire to sell cars. And Phillips Petroleum didn't gain from trolleys either. They wanted them gone. I mean, the National City Lines was was dedicated to taking the trolleys out. And so the conspiracy theory, so General Motors' role in it isn't misrepresented as far as them being...
They're not getting railroaded, as it were.
Right. But General Motors and Phillips Petroleum were so late to the party. And really, if the traction interests had been allowed to raise their fares, or if the traction interests had the foresight to make the trolley lines a separate grade from the street,
or help put the cities on the hook for some of the maintenance of roads in general,
there's no reason why trolleys wouldn't have survived through the 20th century.
But nobody's making, at a corporate level, nobody's making decisions for 20 years from now. Everybody then is now. I mean, it's worse now.
Or 2 years from now.
Right, exactly. Nowadays, it's more like, do the numbers look good this quarter? So I get my bonus. I mean, that's That's industry now.
And in the end, it is a case where that particular American brand of capitalism, where we hope that the market will make the best choice, is at the heart of the fact that there are great trolleys in Europe and Asia and not in America, because in those other countries, there's much more of a holistic sense that these aren't. I mean, the trolley lines in Amsterdam are not they're not a private utility, right? They're not a profit generating company owned by a robber baron with a diamond stick pin,
which is what Americans want. Where's the diamond stick pin guy? I trust him.
Right.
I don't want this thing for everyone to enjoy.
And we see that in a lot of utilities in the United States, right? The electrical utilities, which in most cases now are public utilities, all began as private utilities. There's always some company that says, hey cities, let us come in and we'll wire everything up and we'll handle all the billing for you. And the cities go, well, sure, that sounds good. And then eventually you either have to sort of nationalize those utilities when you recognize that they're a universal and ubiquitous good, or you have like we do in most American cities now, you have an internet service provider that's a private company. And everyone in the city, including all of the, all city businesses, the government, everybody needs the internet. It's no longer like HBO. It becomes a public utility. And I think in internet in particular, in 20 years, it will be inconceivable to us that was run by some company with a guy with a diamond stick pin in his vest.
And that concludes The Death of Trolleys. Entry 320.GN4519, certificate number 14871, in the omnibus. Speaking of disappearing technologies, if you somehow have access to the social media of the early 21st century, you should really take the time to follow at John Roderick, at Ken Jennings, and at Omnibus Project. Why not? Bump up our numbers. Make us look and feel good to our peers. Would it kill you? You could also send email if you have questions or comments about this endeavor to the omnibusproject@gmail.com. I just want to thank Penny, who emailed us her academic writing about having sex in space. It's called Joining the 250-Mile High Club. Let me just note that I didn't solicit this in any way. She just decided to send me a long article about some of the issues regarding extraterrestrial copulation. You could send us physical items to our P.O. Box, 55744, Shoreline, Washington, 98155. For example, you and I just got a book about parenting teenagers called Teenagers Suck.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, really, I'm on board with this book already.
Teenagers do suck. My daughter and I were walking home the other night along a dark trail, and she said, "I'm scared." And I said, "Well, there's only a few things that could hurt us on this trail. Wild animals. But most wild animals you can scare away by jingling your keys." And I jingled my keys. She said, "That works?" And I said, "Mostly." And I said, "The other thing that could hurt us is ghosts. But ghosts also flee from the sound of jingled keys."
Luckily.
I jingled them again. And I said, "The other two things that could hurt us are bad men. And bad men do not run from the sound of jingled keys.
They like jingling,
but
it lures them in.
Bad men will run from daddy because daddy is a badder man. And the last thing to worry us are teenage boys. And teenage boys are not scared of keys, and they're not scared of daddy, and they're not scared of ghosts, and they're not scared of bad men even, because teenage boys suck.
They, in many cases, are scared of teenage girls. So maybe your daughter will be able to help you in a few years.
Well, I sure was.
Keep them away.
I know, where I'm standing there surrounded by a gang of wilding teenagers, and she steps forward and goes, "You guys have bad hair." And they all shrink up and curl up in balls and die.
Save me from confident teenagers. We also got sent you got sent a flat-brimmed baseball hat. I don't understand the reference here. It says Précisément.
No.
Is this a reference to one of your...
Wow.
You're very happy about the Précisément hat.
I'm so happy.
It's so easy to make John happy.
Oh, I'm so happy. Hang on.
Why that particular French adverb?
Oh, wow. Look, it's exactly right.
It's Précisément right.
So, to explain, a few years ago, I was dating a woman who was a lawyer and a tech company lawyer, a San Francisco tech company lawyer, who moved to Los Angeles and became a tech company lawyer for an even bigger tech company.
You're making her too likable in this story.
She's she's known on some of the podcasts in the John Roderick podcast universe as Millennium Girlfriend.
I've always wondered if she's aware of being Millennium Girlfriend.
Well, some of the other lawyers in her office I know used to listen to some of the shows, and they would tease her and call me Peepaw. They were like, I was listening to Peepaw on his show.
Single people shouldn't have podcasts. It gets too tricky.
Yeah.
That's why we're putting this show in the ground.
That's right. So she at one point bought me a black baseball hat that had been custom made by some internet entrepreneur.
Hat making outfit.
That said, oh no, but it was a guy. It was like a rich guy, a guy that, some young guy that owned a tech company that was worth $1 billion, had a couple of baseball hats made for himself and his friends that said entrepreneur across the front of a black baseball hat.
You know what's cool? $1 billion and a baseball cap that says entrepreneur.
So she got me one through her insider trading and gave it to me as a gift, which she thought was funny. And for a long time, I wore my entrepreneur baseball hat around in order to please her, because I'm a people pleaser.
You're a Millennium Girlfriend pleaser.
And so there was a picture of me in my entrepreneur baseball hat. And then someone on the internet, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but someone on the internet was goofing around. And I don't know if it's as true on Omnibus, but I often will say, in response to someone who has said something that I think is correct, I will say, précisément.
Mm-hmm.
It's my way. It's just another affirmation.
You're like a backgammon player chasing the old world elegance of Europe.
Précisément. Well, someone, this is now several years ago, photoshopped me in my entrepreneur hat so that it said précisément. And I loved it. It just looked so cool. This photo, this like faked picture. And at some point along the way, I said, again on the internet, I really wish that précisément hat was correct, was actually a real hat and not just a Photoshop. And now someone out there in the world, some friend, has had a précisément hat made. This has to be the only one, or one of only two.
It's turned into, it's like a 3D printer where you can just take some virtual object, although in this case it was not like a CAD object, it was a Photoshop.
But this looks exactly like the picture. It really is real.
It was conjured into reality.
It really is, and it's not.
It's like a genie in a bottle scenario.
It's not fake. It's really embroidered into the hat. And now I have my précisément hat, and I can die a happy man. I cannot think of a gift that has made me happier than this hat.
It looks like it's from a fan in Olympia.
Oh, they're local. They're Washingtonians.
There is a note.
What does it say?
Hey, John, I hope this finds you well. Thanks so much for sharing so much of yourself with the world in word and song.
Oh, that's sweet.
Wear this hat in health. Well, in sickness too, I guess, but hopefully more health. And it's got like a username. I don't know who this is. But
I'm so delighted. I'm so delighted, user.
Keep making all good. I don't know what this sign off means. I'm sure it's some in-joke from one of your other shows.
What does it say?
I don't know. KMAGOOTW. Kamagutwa? Is that a Roderick on the Lineism?
I don't think so.
Keep making all the good out of the world. Keep something. It's got to be out of the world, right?
I don't know. Keep making all good out of the world? That doesn't seem like a good mantra.
keep making all galoshes out of thin weasels.
That seems right.
That's probably it.
Well, anyway, thank you, Thin Weasel 777, and I'm going to wear this hat in good health and in sickness and in health.
You do not need to conjure virtual objects for us and send us physical items, although I'm not against it.
I'm so thrilled.
Thank you so much. You can support us financially. That's the kind of physical object we like appearing out of thin air is American currency. You can do that at patreon.com/omnibus project. It keeps the show healthy and rolling along. You should definitely congregate with your fellow Facebook futurelings on the fan page. There's a similar subreddit if you're boycotting Facebook for all the correct reasons to boycott Facebook, like maybe you dislike the Winklevoss twins.
You can find us on TikTok if you're boycotting Reddit.
John's doing a TikTok dance right now.
You can find us on Kick if you're boycotting TikTok.
You can get high on Shrek if you can't find us on Kick. Did I say all
Addicted to Squeak if you can't take Shrek anymore.
Did I do all the good outros? What did I forget?
So. I think that's everything. Futurelings from our vantage point in your distant past, happily sheltered in our précisement hats. We have no idea how long our civilization survived. Ken's got his whip inflation now pin over there, and he was going to slide it over here to me, but now I think he's keeping it.
Because you got a nice hat. I don't know. In our sad trolleyless world.
We have no definitive. We're not taking a side in whether or not General Motors and Phillips Petroleum are responsible for the death of the world. I personally have long been at war with Firestone tires.
That's the real villain of the piece.
If the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may have been our final word. But if Providence allows, we hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.